Hey, Board Game Geeks, Brian Hazard here. It's time for another session of Then and Now. This is where I take old games and compare them to re-implementations or updates. We're going to be talking today about Catan, the card game, which came out in 1998 and was then re-implemented in 2010 as the Rivals for Catan. Now, just a heads up, guys, I'm actually going to be demoing Rivals for Catan for Catan Studios at Gen Con this year, 2017. So if you guys want to stop by and say hi, please do. I'm going to be at the Catan Studios demo booth Saturday and Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock till about 1 or 2 o'clock. I'll be demoing Catan and Rivals for Catan during that time, so please stop by and say hi. Anyways, the point of this video is just to take a look at what the game was like then, what it's like now, some of the changes that they made, not only in the aesthetics and the quality of the components, but also if they made any changes to the game itself. I'm also going to take a little time to look at the expansions. There were a set of expansions that came out for this, a box of 5 expansions. I apologize that I don't have that box. I bought this used. And we'll be looking at the joy that is the expansions for Rivals of Catan, and then we'll talk a little bit when we're done. So let's take a look. Okay, so let's get down to it. On the right we have Catan, the card game from 1998, and on the left we have Rivals for Catan from 2010. You see there's some cosmetic differences with the back of the cards here. You see, my opinion, a little prettier on the newer ones. That said, the icons and the art on the old version are not so bad. They're both easy to read. I will say that on the original game from 1998, they had these great cheat sheets that came on the roads that do not exist in the newer version, and I think that that's a loss. Those are pretty nice. The old version also had wooden dice and wooden tokens for the pieces. The newer version has plastic dice and acrylic cut hexes, which I think are inferior and sort of detract from the Euro prettiness of the game overall. Now, let's talk about the differences in setup. For whatever reason, in the old game, you were given one of every resource in every region, and you were allowed to put those regions wherever you wanted to when you set up. In the new game, they're actually specific about where your regions should go, and they say you get one of everything except gold. When you started the game in the old game, you would draw 3 cards from any one of these decks in the middle. In the new game, you are allowed to pick one deck and then take any 3 cards that you want from those decks. You'll also notice that in the original game I had 5 decks down here. These are all different cards you can draw into your hands. And these are all the same. This one has 5, but 3 of them are base set, and then 2 of them are from a theme deck. In addition, the event cards in each set have different events that happen when you roll a question mark on the die. There's a card that tells you to reshuffle, and that card is just anywhere in this deck. It doesn't specify anything to set the deck up, which means you could play 3 cards and it would come up again, and then you'd shuffle and play 2 cards and it'd come up again. Whereas in the new game, they take the shuffle the deck card, which is called Yule in this one, and you put it 4th down from the bottom. So 3 cards are randomly put at the bottom of the deck. You have no idea what they are, and you won't know which ones they are that won't come up during this round through the deck. In the old base game, it's 5 decks. It's always the same cards. If you want to expand any sort of variety, you have to buy the expansions for the game. And admittedly, those expansions come in a 5 expansion set, but this is it. This is the whole game. That's always the game. In the newer version, the base game is really just an introductory game. But once you know how to play the game, they start introducing themes that actually come with the base game. And they suggest doing it in a certain order, first starting with the era of gold, then moving on to the era of turmoil and progress. And once you know how to play all of them, you will shuffle all 3 of those with a little bit of trimming into one full deck that will allow you to play with all the different bits. But the advantage of that is that if you have a person that you tend to play with that doesn't like confrontation, you could take the confrontation deck and not play with it. So you don't have arsons and riots and that sort of thing. So that's an advantage, I think, in the variety and the dynamic setup of the new game that the base game doesn't have. And it also makes the learning curve a little bit easier for people who haven't played the game before. There has been some changes in the terminology and the rules, which I want to touch on. One thing that I really didn't like is that in the old game, these were referred to as development stacks, and these were referred to as expansion stacks. Expansions are what we call add-ons to games. Catan is kind of notorious for this. Their other games have this problem too about extensions and expansions. You can get an expansion, but for more players you need the extension. In this game, the base game has a set of cards called expansion cards. This is not great for trying to explain this to people who are used to that term meaning something else. In the new game, They refer to the cards as center cards and draw stacks. God bless them. So these are not development cards, they are center cards. And they are called center cards because you take them from the center. So that's this row right here. This right here, these are draw stacks. When you add things to your principality, they still call these like expansion areas. That's a little more forgivable. They call them that in the base game too. But at least it's not so confusing that people won't understand. In the base game, when the event card has to be reshuffled, that is called year end. In the expansion game, that card is referred to as Yule. In the original game, the order of actions during your turn was event, production, actions, draw, and pass the dice. In the new game, it's roll the dice, actions, replenish hand, and exchange one card. Now that change there at the end is actually kind of significant, and I will touch on that a little bit more. In the original game, although the event dice has multiple colors on it, they never really explain why, and they don't have a particular meaning. In the new version of the game, there is a meaning behind it, and it's either black or red. If you roll the red Brigand's Attack, that means that what happens on the die is going to happen before you collect your resources for the turn. If you roll a black icon, it means that this event will happen after you get your resources for the turn. And those resources are based on what you roll on this die that you roll at the same time. Now, each version of the game still has these two special tokens that will result in a victory point. These tokens are worth 1 victory point each. In the original game, the windmill token went to whoever had the most commerce points, and commerce points were indicated by windmill icons. So if you had the most windmill icons and a city built in your principality, then you would get the windmill token. In the new game, this is the token. It's a scale, and it represents trade advantage. So if you have 3 or more trade advantage points, I think they're called, in this game, and those are indicated by those symbols right there, if you have 3 or more and more than your opponent, then you would be the owner of this token and you would get an extra point at the end of the game. The original game also had the knight token, which was worth a victory point, and that went to whoever had the strongest knights. That was indicated by who had the most cumulative total of this black number here next to the fist on all of their knights that are in play. If you had more than your opponent, you received this token, and if you had the token at the end of the game, you would get a victory point. This is also very similar. This is the knight token for the new game. This represents strength advantage. So if the heroes in your principality have a total number of axes more than the other player, and at least 3, so 3 or more and more than the other player, then you would get the strength advantage and you would get the knight token. So let's talk about the differences in the event dice. As I said, one big advantage of the old game is that it's a nicer die. It's wooden, it's big. I like it more. In the original game, if you rolled Year of Plenty, everybody gets to take 1 resource. In the new game, you have Plentiful Harvest, pretty much the same thing. If you roll it, both people get to take 1 resource. In the original game, you might roll this. This is the tournament icon. You would look at your knights again and see how many tournament points they all had, and whoever had the most gets 1 resource. That is this number right there. If there was a tie, nobody got anything because nobody won the tournament. In the new game, instead of tournaments, you have celebration. So you count the number of skill points on your heroes, because we have heroes now instead of knights. So you would look at a hero and you would see how many skill points they have, and whichever player has the most skill points gets 1 resource of their choice. However, in this case, it's a celebration. So if you have a tie, you both get a resource. In the original game, if you roll a windmill, that means trade advantage, and whoever is currently in possession of the windmill token will get to take 1 resource of their choice from their opponent. In the new game, that is the same exact ability. Whoever is in possession of the trade advantage token, which is in acrylic scale in this case, would get to take 1 resource from their opponent. Very mean. Both games still have a version of the Brigand's Attack, but they're slightly different. In the original game, when the Brigands attacked, if you rolled this on the event die, anyone who had more than 7 resources would lose all of their ore and wool, which means, I guess they were stealing it to make weapons and more clothes. There was a restriction that it couldn't happen in the first 2 rounds of the game. That was to make it a little easier on you. In the new game, the same thing happens. If you have more than 7 resources, you lose all of your wool and gold. I think this makes more sense, because if I was a brigand and I was attacking you, I wouldn't take your ore. I would totally take your gold. There's also no restriction in the Rivals for Catan version. They can attack you whenever they feel like attacking you, which, arguably, that makes sense. The event cards are largely the same. In the new game, however, you always make sure that there are 3 randomly selected cards at the bottom of the deck covered by the Yule card, which causes you to reshuffle. So there's always 3 cards and you don't know what they are, so you do not have perfect information on what's left in the deck while you're playing. In the old version, when that card came up, the New Year card, you just reshuffled it back in. It may come up a second time, 2 cards from the top of the deck. So it's an improvement that they changed that. As for the general flow of the game, both versions are largely the same. Biggest difference as far as playing cards is that action cards in the original game could not be played until players had a combined total of 7 points. In the new game, there is no restriction like that. You can play an action card whenever you have an action card to play. Now, there are some interesting differences in the building of cards. In the old game, again, some bad terminology, the green cards that went here were called region expansions, and the reds are called city expansions. In the new game, this makes a little more sense. The green cards are called settlement city expansions, and the red cards are called city expansions, which is a better way to distinguish these cards, because in the newer version of the game, we actually have a totally different kind of card, which is brown, which is called a region expansion. And these don't exist in the original version of the game outside of the expansions, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So here you have settlement city expansions that can go on settlements or cities, and city expansions that can only go on cities, and then region expansions, which actually go on regions, like this. They go below a region, which is a little bit different and interesting. Now, there's a significant change in the rules for drawing up cards at the end of your turn. In the original game, if you had less than your hand limit, you could draw a card from any of the stacks. And you could do this by either taking one randomly from one of the stacks or paying any 2 resources to pick a card from the stack for each card that you draw. So I could actually pick up a stack, flip it over, shuffle through it, and pick one that I wanted. You can't rearrange the stack. But for every card that I'm short from my hand limit, so if I only had 1 card in my hand at the end of the turn, then I could take this one random, and then I could pay 2 resources and go into any stack and take another one of my choice. Once I'd done that, once I'd gotten to my hand limit, that would be the end of my drawing. Now, if at the end of my turn I already had too many cards in my hand, I would have to discard down to my hand limit by putting this card under one of the stacks of my choice. And then I would have the option to exchange one of my cards by picking a card and doing what I mentioned earlier, which is paying 2 resources to take any card you want, or randomly pulling one off for free. You cannot exchange a card if you're below the hand limit. You can only do it if you have more cards than your hand limit or equal to your hand limit at the end of the round, which seems like a weird thing. In the newer version of this game, this whole process is greatly streamlined. If you don't have enough cards in your hand, you can draw up to your hand limit from any stack. It is random. You don't get to pick them from all over the place. If you have too many cards at the end of the round, then you would discard down to your hand limit, and we're good to go. Now, the difference is there's an extra action in the new version, which is you may exchange a card. So it doesn't matter whether or not you were discarding down to your hand limit or drawing up to your hand limit. Once you're done, you may take one of your cards from your hand, discard it to the bottom of a pile, and then either draw a new card random or pay 2 resources and take a new card. So this is a little more streamlined. It's a little more fair because you get to exchange no matter what. I don't know if that's what they intended in the original game, but that's really not what it says. It also simplifies and shortens the amount of time it takes for somebody to draw up their cards, because you only get to exchange 1 card, not every single card that you want to swap out for. The other thing is the difference between how you determine what your hand limit is. In the old game, if you had an abbey or a library, each one of those would increase your hand size. In the new game, your hand limit is determined by how many buildings in your principality have progress icons on them. You could have all sorts of expansions come down the line that have the progress icon on there that would increase your hand size. So those are the big differences between the games as far as the base games. I'm going to touch briefly on the expansions and tell you a little bit about the differences there. I will say that each one has one specific expansion that stands out from the rest as being unique and interesting in the way that it works. Now I do have to apologize. I got my original Catan the card game secondhand, so I don't have the box for the expansions. Now this was a good deal back in the day, because when you got this expansion, you got 5 new expansion sets. And essentially each expansion set, Trade and Change, Politics and Intrigue, Knights and Merchants, Science and Progress, which are these decks here, added about 3 event cards to the deck, and then a whole bunch of new actions and buildings that gave it a particular theme. And those are fine, and the theme is noticeable. But the biggest home run, or the most interesting of these, was without a doubt the Wizards and Dragons expansion, which changed quite a bit of the game. So let me touch on that one as probably the best reason out of the 5, at least if you're a fantasy nerd and you want some fantasy in your Catan, as to why you would want to get these expansions. When you play with Wizards and Dragons, you no longer build cities, you build citadels. Citadels are built instead of cities. They cost different resources, and when you build them, you would place them over a settlement, just like you would in the base game. In the base game. But the difference is you have to put it with the wizard absent face up. Right now, that is worth 1 victory point. In the expansion stacks, which if you use the expansions with the original game, you turn the original expansion stacks into 4 decks, and then you add 2 more decks over here, which are all the expansion cards out of here. The theme cards, I guess you should call them. And these theme cards are much different. So one of the biggest differences is you can hire wizards. Now a wizard will only live in a citadel, so you cannot put it around a settlement. It has to be in a citadel. And it can only be placed by certain specific regions. So in this case, this wizard will only settle by gold or wheat, and I happen to have gold and wheat right here next to my citadel. So much like a region expansion in the Rivals for Catan, the wizard goes up here. I believe he starts with no power. And once you put a wizard down, then you flip this over and it becomes worth 2 victory points. So that's cool, because it sort of gives meaning to the wizard being home. Now, in order to give power to your wizard, once per turn, you may, on a 1-to-1 trade basis, change any one of the resources by the wizard into 1 magic point for the wizard. You could do 3 for 3 if you wanted to. He has a limit of 3, just like everybody else. The difference is that you can only do this once per turn, and you may not spend magic from that wizard on the same turn that he is given magic, so that slows you down a little bit. Once you've got some wizards on the board, things start getting interesting, because then you'll start to be able to play some of the other cards that come out, like this Magic Kitchen that requires 2 magic points to be played. So in order to have those magic points, you have to have wizards on the table, and you have to have resources to change into magic. So once you have that, you would be able to place this, but of course it's a purple magic card that can only be played on a citadel. It can be played in either location. City cards, by the way, cannot be played on a citadel. They are not a city, so you can play green region expansions, in this game they're called that go on settlements, or you can play these purple ones, but no city expansions on citadels. Also, wizards are seclusionary and mean, so you cannot have 2 citadels next to each other. There has to be always at least 1 settlement between your citadels. You'll also get things like this, which are magic books. These work just like buildings that you put on your citadel, and they give you abilities that you can use that affect your dragons. Dragons? What's that? Yes, there are dragons. Nope, that ain't it. This is an action, actually. This is a wizard's action card that you pay magic for, and then you can do it. Attack one of your opponent's wizards, roll the die. The losing wizard return to the bottom of the expansion stack. Mean! But you also have Samsor, the black dragon. He's got a strength like a knight, so he counts towards your strength advantage of getting you the knight token. He doesn't have a tournament value because knight dragons don't do tournaments, but he is expensive to get out on the board. So this is interesting. This is probably the coolest of the expansions for the original game. It gives you an opportunity to do something a little bit different, and definitely adds a little life. So now let's talk a little bit about what's cool about the new version of the game. When I picked up Rivals of Catan at Gen Con a few years back, I also picked up both of these expansions because they were both available right then and there. I don't think there's been more since then. But that's okay, because with the original first 3 themes that came with the base game and the 3 that come in each year, that gives you 9 different ways to play the game. Each theme has a unique flair to it and a feel to it that makes it different and interesting to play. To be fair, I've not played all 6 of these. I think I've played about 4 of them. What I like also, by the way, is that these tell the story of the history of Catan as it was written in a novel that's out there. And so this rule book for the Age of Enlightenment will actually tell you what order to play all 9 themes so that you can see the history of Catan, which is kind of awesome. This one is cool, and the really heavy hitter in this is the Era of Barbarians, which you have to play until 13 points because they've got so much going on. It's got castles and border forts, all sorts of skirmishes. Really kind of a neat one. But by far, my favorite expansion for any Catan card game, old or new, comes out of the Age of Enlightenment, and that expansion is the Era of Explorers. So this is the setup for the Era of Explorers, and right away you can see how cool this is. There are 9 ocean cards over here that represent the ocean beside the island of Catan, and both players have the same ocean cards. Players are able to use your Explorer Harbor in order to build Explorer ships that you use to set sail out here. You can spend 1 lumber and 1 wool in order to build an Explorer ship, and you have up to 3 that you can build. The glare is terrible, and I apologize for that. And then once they're built, on your turn, as an action, you can, each Explorer ship may take 1 action, and that action can either be to discover, which is to move on to an unflipped card, or to do a mission, which is to move on to a card that already has been flipped. Now, in order to move these, you have to have sail points. Sail points come from different buildings in the game, and they have this icon right here with the sail on it. Come on, focus. Okay, there's the sail. You can also get it if you build this region expansion of the shipyard. That tells you how fast your Explorer ships can move. So for a discovery, you can move that many spaces away from your Explorer Harbor based on the number of sail icons that you have. So if you have 1 sail icon, you can move 1 space and discover. So you might discover something like this island. And if you, on another turn, do a discovery action there, or when you do the discovery here, choose, it gives you an ability. But if you do a mission here, you pay 2 lumber, and you rotate the card to the next higher level, which gives it a different icon, which is kind of cool. And each time you do that mission, you'll raise it higher. Now, the first player who raises it all the way up to the 3rd level gets a victory point, and that means the other player can never get that 3rd level. So if once somebody gets to a 3rd level, the other player is stuck not being able to. Perhaps you find a shipwreck. Shipwrecks are cool because you receive a resource, and then you can't do it a second time. But then you might also find pirates. And when you find a pirate, you can fight them. You roll the die and add the number of cannon icons you have on the different buildings in your principality. And if you beat them, you get to tilt them once and take whatever the icon is. Each time you beat them, you get to move them 1 more time. And if you were the first one to get them all the way over, you'll get the victory point for defeating them, and the other player can't. Now, once a pirate's defeated, no one can ever take an action on that pirate again. On the islands, even though the other player may not be able to get it all the way up to the 3rd level, they can still take actions on it. They just can't ever reach level 3. Now, each ship can only take 1 action each turn, and each card can only have 1 action done upon it each turn. So that does limit how fast you can do things out here. If you lose against a pirate by moving on to it and fighting it and getting defeated, then your ship is destroyed. It just goes back over here, and it can be built on a later turn. So this just gives you an option to be doing this whole other thing. The rest of the game, you still got everything going on over here in the base principality, but you also have the option to do some really cool things over here. This is by far my favorite expansion, and is a big reason why I would say get the newer game over the older Catan card game. All right, folks, so there you have it. Catan the card game and Rivals for Catan. Rivals for Catan has more interesting things going on. I like the Wizards and Dragons, and if you're a big fantasy buff, or if you're just a completionist and you would want to have the old version, then sure, go get Catan the card game. But the mechanics that are in the Wizards and Dragons also exist in some way in the expansions that come from Rivals for Catan. And the Explorer thing is just awesome. And that's my favorite by far. I think it's a really neat idea, and it's a fun way to add on to the game. Maybe I'll see you guys at Gen Con. Like I said, I will be there this August in Indianapolis. Feel free to stop by Catan Studios Saturday or Sunday morning of Gen Con. Right now I'm scheduled to demo Catan games from like 10 to 1 o'clock on both of those days. That may change. They may move me around. But I'm hoping I will see some of you there. Feel free to leave some comments down below. You don't have to subscribe if you don't want to. That's not what I'm aiming for. I don't know if you've noticed, I just make videos that I'm interested in, and maybe that doesn't get me a lot of traffic, but that's, that's fine. Anyways, enjoy, and I will see you guys on The Geek. Take care.